And he's. No, you're fine. Okay. Dr. Gadepalli is a faculty researcher at TIER and a pediatric surgeon at Mott Children's Hospital. A dedicated surgeon, scientist, and teacher, Dr. Gadepalli has spent the past decade studying the educational environment for pediatric surgeons and how to prepare the next generation for the changing times. We're so excited to have you today. Please take it away.
All right, thanks for that introduction. So, do I look at him here?
Oh, it doesn't matter.
I guess they're in person, so they can just stare at the back of my head.
It's kind of set up so they can see the whole room, so it's not a big deal either way.
Yeah, so, I would say probably maybe 80 and 90% of my work recently has been around pediatric IBD with Jeremy Adler. But I figured I'd talk about what else I do outside of that, because Jeremy was gonna present the IBD stuff separately. So I focus a lot on what do pediatric surgeons look like in the future, because I'm a pediatric surgeon, and this past year I was made a fellowship program director for our fellowship, and so I was gonna talk a little bit about all the stuff that I've thought about and things I think about right now on here. So I'll go through who we are as pediatric surgeons, what we do, and how we hopefully can get better. So who we are. So for those who don't know, the way to become a pediatric surgeon is actually a super long road. It's so after college and then medical school, you match into general surgery residency, which is 5 years. But pediatric surgery is considered like one of the most competitive post-surgical fellowships. That and plastics kind of go hand in hand. What makes peds surgery so competitive is that the number of programs that are available for fellowship are very low, whereas the number applying are high comparatively. So each year you might have 90 to 100 applicants for 40 to 50 programs. So more than half the applicants won't match their first go around. I didn't match my first go around in peds surgery. And so there's a barrier there that, you know, determines who pediatric surgeons are, because you got to match into a pediatric surgery fellowship program in order to become a peds surgeon. After you match into peds surgery, then you do 2 years of fellowship and then become faculty and so forth. And we'll go through what they look like. So who we are. So it starts at the match. So this is my first project back in like 2015 around this. And what I did was I surveyed the Association of Pediatric Surgery Program Directors, and we asked them what, where did the candidate rank match? Like it's a match. So the way it works is all the applicants apply to programs, all the programs then rank the applicants based on where they think would be a good fit for them. And then all of the applicants then rank the programs based on where they think that would be a good fit for them. And there's a match process that I won't go into more detail, but like it tells you where you're going to end up based on that match process. So starting from 2008, when I was in the match, we just kind of surveyed people. They got a little bit fed up with us by 2010, so we skipped a year and then did it like every other year. And you can see in 2014, the responses kind of dropped down. So they were tired of us asking. But basically, we said, where did you match your candidate in that year? And the median number is somewhere around 3. So presented a different way. This is year to year box whisker plot of the median rank is the line in the box, and then the lowest rank is the top highest number. So most people match in their top 5, basically. So what that means is what programs are specifically looking for in applicants is different among every program. So it's not like, you know, if you were looking for the same things in every applicant, you shouldn't see this. You shouldn't see this year after year after year, because the same applicant should be ranked higher by all the programs. But that's not what's happening. And pretty consistently, the applicants and the programs kind of match. And so you're like, okay, so there's some kind of a fit algorithm. So the match is working like it's supposed to work. However, every applicant has to go to every single program because it's a super competitive match. And so if the program offers you an interview, you're going to attend as an applicant. But that means you're going to 45 different programs to like interview. This makes no sense when only the top 5 in every program are gonna match. So the programs have a pretty generally good idea of who they're gonna end up matching. And so we said,
Is it local?
is this local?
Like.
Is what's driving.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
that's what my hypothesis would be, like, you have like
Geographic.
surgeons, and then they're like already at U of M for surgery, and then they're like, no, all the.
Actually, it's
Really?
not. Yeah. I mean, I'm not from Michigan, I'm from New York. I would have ranked the New York programs higher had they wanted me. But we'll get into fit in a little bit. So then I said, okay, maybe the programs could reduce how many people they interview. And so we said this was the rank based on the different quartiles of the number of people they interviewed. So we said, okay, people who interview a ton of programs, it's not like their ranks are that different than the people who interview very few. Like it doesn't matter how many people you are gonna interview. Why don't you just decrease that amount ever so slightly so that the applicant doesn't have to travel to like 45 programs. And so blue represents the interviews that were actually conducted in those years. And then the brown, orange, whatever, the red represents the lowest number the program directors for that group thought they needed in order to like match their candidates. So we were able to subsequently decrease it from 30 down to 20. So now pretty consistently across pediatric surgery programs, they'll interview approximately 20 to 25 candidates each year. So we weren't able to decrease it all the way down to like 10 or 12, but like, subsequent studies after this looked at in-person interviews versus online interviews and so forth. But this was one of the earlier studies around how do we decrease match interviews. So then it comes down to fit, right? So then this is our process of how we determine fit for our program. And it's based on like, you'll see a lot of like the OHEI kind of like, how do you reduce bias in your applicant interviews and that kind of stuff. So we receive interview applications and then we randomize them typically by like their ID number, the AAMC ID number, so that like when we get them, we de-identify all of them. And I give them to faculty groups, 2 different groups, ideally composed of like very different personalities, characteristics of individuals. And I try to recruit them every year for like 3 to 4. I pay them based on the number of applications they're gonna review. There's like 90 applications, I split them into 45, so each of them we're gonna review about 45 applications. And we score them using a holistic rubric. This is our rubric. And basically it looks at letters of recommendation, general surgery residency, the type of work that they did that was, community work, so forth, publications. Some of these are subjective, like distance traveled, perseverance, endurance, commitment, things that they've potentially achieved, hardiness, grit, resilience, ABSAT scores, everything just goes on this rubric. So ideally, I'm trying to like reduce the bias around like, oh, I really like that person, or, oh, I like this person's letter, or I tried to like, it's not me, I continue this from my predecessor who created the process, but we tried to like eliminate as much as bias as possible within our system. We talked to the overarching.
So has surgery always paid for this, or is this something that they did as an initiative to have a more comprehensive review?
So we do this for general surgery as well as pediatric surgery. Nationally, that's not how it's typically done.
Yeah.
Typically, it's a free-for-all. There's no standardized system. And so we talked to the APS-CPD is the Association of Pediatric Surgery Training Program Directors. Don't ask me why this acronym was made long before I started on here. I probably would have changed it to something more fun, but they started a DEI committee of which was a member, and we created like a document that hopefully people could use in terms of like, how do you reduce bias? And we kind of looked at it with application screening, preparing for the interviews, conducting the interviews, creating our rank list, and like potentially best practices amongst the group. And then we distributed this to like all the program directors and published it within our journal so that people can use it. We gave some sample interview questions they can use. We asked about, we kind of described ways, if this looks familiar, this is all from the OA stuff that we have here. And so as you can see, like Michigan has had a huge presence nationally in terms of like influencing how do we reduce bias within pediatric surgery. And after we did all this stuff, people still came back to us and they said, well, with this holistic review stuff, you're just like picking out people who don't really deserve to be pediatric surgeons, and you're just highlighting people based on like, you know, arbitrary ways. And so we said, okay, fine, we will look at our method of what we've done for this last several years, and we'll compare those who had a traditional review before we started this and those who had a holistic review since we started this. And what we found was that, so we did find that the additional professional graduate degrees that people have after their MD decreased, so 28% versus 42%. But their USMLE scores, their peer reviewed publications actually improved, if anything. And then where their medical school was or the residency training was didn't really change at all. And so, in fact, it wasn't like we were recruiting different types of applicants. In fact, I couldn't even randomize them this perfectly. I mean, it's like 48.2 versus 47% affiliated with a peds surgery fellowship. It's just who is interested in peds surgeries, who is interested in peds surgery. So the people we're interviewing was not dramatically different amongst the groups.
Wait, am I reading this right? Your average applicant had 22 peer-reviewed publications as of the time that they applied.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay.
Wow, surgery's competitive.
Pediatric surgery is the most competitive amongst like fellowships after general surgery. So yes, if you don't do research or some form of research, you're probably not going to match it in peds surgery.
Does that extend the training? Like, are people doing their research after or extending their
Usually in between
residencies?
the residencies. Yeah, so most people will take time off either after their second or third year. I didn't match in peds surgery. I didn't take time off during that time period. I took my time off at the end of my residency, and I did a year on the ECMO lab here, and then I did 2 years basically of research afterwards. I did a critical care fellowship and then a year in the ECMO lab. But you have to do something, otherwise it's just, you're not competitive. And as a program director now, it's like incredibly hard. This number has only gone up since we've looked at this. So it's continually increased.
Okay, can I ask a question, Fred? Coming from a field where we're having trouble getting enough applicants for the number of
Yeah.
positions. So what drives the interest in pediatrics per se? I mean, it's not like you guys get paid oodles more than the cardiothoracic or the transplant folks or the orthopods or.
Yeah, it's not gonna be financed.
Why do people want to go into?
Yeah,
peds
it's not gonna be finance, and in fact, like, you know, financially, you're deferring your salary for years and years and years just to get in. And so in fact, it's actually detrimental to you from a financial standpoint to go into peds surgery, right? Like, you're better off making money earlier and then investing it than you are deferring all of this for a later time period. It has to do, I couldn't tell you exactly what influences people to go into peds surgery. I can just tell you what influenced me to go into peds surgery, and it's typically the who more than the what. Like, you run into someone that influences you, that gets you excited about the field. And that was it for me to go into general surgery as well as to go into peds surgery. Like, actually, was really looking forward to being like a pediatrician or a cardiologist when I went to med school. And then when I did my general surgery residency, I came across residents that actually were like, he's an idiot, but he works really hard, so we're happy to take him as a general surgeon. And I was like, sweet, I can do that. Like, and that's like literally how I got in. I just was not that smart, but like, if someone told me what to do, I was more than happy to do it. And so that was like perfect for like what they were looking for in a general surgery resident. And so you just do as you're told, don't ask a lot of questions, don't complain, don't whine. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. And that's how I got into general surgery. And then as I applied for peds surgery, I didn't have 22 publications. In fact, I had 0. And I didn't match my first go around. And then I came here, started doing research, and I was like, holy crap, this place is a factory. And so like you get influence from there, and then you know, that influence led me to be like, gosh, I really like academics. I really like scholarship. I like learning about why we do things and not just doing them because somebody else told me to do them. And that influenced me going to academics. So I would say the who has a huge influence more than the what. Like eventually I'm like, wow, I really like what I do, but I had no concept of what a pediatric surgeon really was until I became a pediatric surgeon. Like I thought I did, and you see other people do it, but like I don't think you fully understand it. I think it's the people that influence you. So like I don't know if it's true for like most of the people in this room, but it's usually like most of the people I talk to in ped surgery, I can usually ask them who is that person that influenced you to go into ped surgery, and they can name one individual that stands out to them somewhere in their career arc that got them excited about what they do. And they're like, yeah, this person got me interested. They were nice to me. They helped me. They spent time with me. They taught me stuff, and that got me excited. And so I continued in that pathway. It's never the financial stuff. It's just too hard.
I think that's true, a lot of
I was gonna
pediatrics.
say, it's never the
Right?
financial thing for pediatrics.
That's
especially.
always-
Well, I was
Always.
wondering if surgeons were different, right?
I
Like,
can't imagine.
Yeah.
But I think that's like where you have like pockets of like talented leadership in different institutions and different divisions, so then you'll see like people sprout up, right? But it feels a little like random, because it kind of is like, you're like, it's the emulation, it's the leadership.
There is
piece
some
that,
level
really-
of like, once you committed to something, then you feel like you needed to complete that too. Where we have residents that have either attempted to match and didn't match, or want to match and have committed to like matching. That once, it's almost like you know, whatever that fallacy is called, where like you committed enough that you feel like you need to see it through.
Sunk cost. Sunk cost.
Cost fallacy, yeah, that's it.
It's always good to have a psychologist.
yeah, I was going to say, the voice from above, yeah.
Because that probably plays into it, especially when you're like talking about 7 or 8 years of your life dedicated to get into ped surgery. So.
Sorry, ped surgery is 7 years of gen surgery and then more training, or is it?
So 5 years of clinical general
5
surgery,
years.
typically 2 to 3 years of research to get in. And so that's, you're talking about 7 or 8 years already, and then 2 more years of pediatric.
It's still 7
fellowship.
years in total.
No,
But
that's
7
before you get to the fellowship. You haven't even gotten to the peds.
So clinically, 5 years of general surgery. To get into the fellowship, you're gonna commit 2 to 3 years of research.
Right,
And then you're gonna do a 2-year fellowship. So you're talking about
9
a
years.
decade of your life to get it, to become a ped surgeon after medical school.
And so a regular general surgeon, usually just, they don't necessarily need to take that 2 years, they use do 2 years
That's
during their 7-year.
That's right, that's right. So if you, which is what I thought I was gonna be, so I did general surgery at a community program after my medical school to become bread and butter general surgeon, which would be 5 years after medical school. And then during my general surgery residency, a pediatric surgeon influenced me that, wow, this is really cool. I wanna do this. This seems like something I would really enjoy long term. The reality though is that you're gonna, whatever you end up doing, like that career pathway, that's like 30 to 40 years of your life. Like, so you're talking about an extra 5 years or whatever, that's like meaningless in the long run. Like, looking back now, it felt like a really big deal to defer like 5 more years of my life to either do general surgery or pediatric surgery, whatever. But like, now that I've done it, I'm like, that 5 years is totally worth it for me. Like, I'm happy what I do. I like what I do. Like, I'm gonna do it for the next 40 years. Pretty low likelihood of like burning out from doing that. Like, I enjoy it. So it brings me joy. Like, that's okay. You know what I mean? So it's like, if it ends up being something you like doing, that your salaried life, after you're done with all of that, that's like 40 years of your life. So I think like in the long run, it feels like a lot because it's early in your life and you're like, you know, 5 years when you're like, I don't know, 25 or 30, like feels like a really long time. But when you're like 45 or 50, it really is not that long a time.
Samir, Samir, can I ask you a question? I can't see how to raise my hand on this thing, but when you're in the pediatric surgery fellowship, are there any skills that are specific to working with parents of children? So the interactions that you have, the individuals who make decisions are proxy decision makers. Is there any training in that? That's one. And isn't there any training in shared decision making?
Yes, for the first one, there is training in how to interact with proxy decision makers. That's definitely addressed. But shared decision making, I think, is an area that probably could use a lot more work in. Because that concept does not necessarily apply for everything we do as pediatric surgeons, right? Like if you're coming in and you have a massive tumor that's probably going to need to be resected, otherwise you might die. Like there's not a lot of shared decision making. If you come in and you had a car accident and you're actively bleeding, there's no shared decision making. Like you're going to do what I tell you you're going to do. Like that is my decision. Like there's no, so I think there's a lot of things that we do in pediatric surgery that really is like, even appendicitis, like I would love to say there's a lot of shared decision making, but you have appendicitis, you're probably going to get your appendix taken out. Like there's 2/3 of the patients, even if I give them an option of not using antibiotics, will choose an appendectomy. And that's in a multi-center study. And so pretty consistently, if you have appendicitis, you're probably getting the appendix out. So I don't know how much shared decision making that plays into it. So I'm just saying that probably could use a lot more training amongst us because we just don't get that practice. There are many, many areas where there is shared decision making, but like how to act with a proxy decision maker, that's definitely addressed in our training.
And a related, not a related question, but how do you decide on the scope, how far your type of surgery might overlap with other surgical specialties? So I'll give you an example, working in the area of DSD.
Yeah.
There would be
Dr. Sandberg, Dr.
Yeah.
Sanger, I'm going to address that in a little bit. So hold
Okay,
on to
good.
that part.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what we did find was this holistic method does help, doesn't dramatically change who we end up ranking, but it changes the people who identify as URIM. So of the 132 40 offered interviews, 42% identified as URIM versus 30% prior to our holistic review. So they were just as, if not more qualified, more of the URIM match were offering interviews. We also looked at pediatric surgery organization societies that had publicly archived executive board membership and a list of like presidents. So all of these have the word pediatric or surgery and both on there. And what we found was there was a dramatic like male to female or directional shift on here where 26% were currently on the board that were female or identified as female. So none of the societies has anyone who was non-binary. So we tried to contact and identify whether they identify as male, female, or non-binary. And none of them were non-binary. So it was all male, female, and 26% identified as female, 22% identified as female as chairpersons. And then people said, hey, this is not, you're just identifying at the current time period. So we asked them for past president lists, and 7 societies were willing to give them to us. And we found that their past presidents were also pretty poor. It was maybe from 0 to 8% in this list. And then they said, well, you're just catching a trend. It's different if you look at overall distribution. So we did that. We looked at the time intervals and we said, how many of your past presidents were male versus female? And it's not limits. They're like, well, it takes time. It's going to improve over time. It's like, no, it won't. Like it's pretty stagnant. And so what we did was kind of branching out the state. This is one of the coolest projects I've ever been part of. But this came about with an idea where I was talking to my, I was on this committee called the Brengy Brooks Committee that promotes like, female pediatric surgeons. I said, hey, I read this book, like children's book to my daughter all the time, and she's very excited about it, about major accomplishments by women in the field. It's called Her Story, and I was like, this is a great book. Can we do something like this, a children's book for pediatric surgeons? Like, they can look at what I do every day, but women in the field who do the same thing. And they said, yeah, it sounds like a great idea, let's do this. And I said, but my one request is I don't want to be on the main authors page. You could put me in acknowledgement somewhere, but it should be from the committee. All the main authors listed should be women. And I said, I would like my daughter to help with some of the icons and artwork. And so you'll see Kaylee Gadepalli is my daughter on there. And so Danielle Dougherty and Heather Hartman were two of my residents that I was mentoring at the time. They're now pediatric surgery fellows in different places across the country. Erin Perlin is one of my partners in pediatric surgery here. And she was the chair of the Benji Brooks Committee at the time. And so we published this book. It's available on Barnes and Nobles. Really cool book. I read with my daughters now. And it talks about famous women pediatric surgeons because we tell a lot of the stories among male pediatric surgeons, like a lot of the instruments. I don't know if any of you guys did a rotation surgery, but I'm sure you were quizzed on some random instrument that had some male name, typically white. And I didn't know who those people were, but like I would hear their stories and then you're like, oh, okay. And you have this imagination of what a male surgeon was. But I was like, we should have these same stories equally distributed among women surgeons. If you're going to change that 11%, people have to dream of going into pediatric surgery and they have to want to be leaders who accomplish great things. And so we published this book. Hopefully it influences some people and has an impact. I don't know, I'll tell you in like 15, 20 years, I guess. We also started this diversity scholars program or the APS-TPD, where 2 scholars are funded each year to support travel, accommodation, meeting registration as general surgeon. So a PGY 1 or 2 general surgery with an interest in ped surgery is usually nominated by their program director. So we reached out to all the program directors in general surgery and we said, nominate a couple people, and then we review the applicants. And it's hard because you'll get like a bunch that you're like, man, if I had money, I would bring them all here. Like it would be so amazing, but we got enough to support 2 scholars, so we had to start somewhere. And so we've done this for a few years now. And the mentors are assigned to meet with the scholars during the meeting. So I was a mentor for one of these meetings when we first started it. And then we have these networking opportunities, and then we meet with all the different people. We go into the committee meetings and so forth. So they get early exposure to life as a ped surgeon. These were our ones for the last couple of years and from very different places in the country, some with access, some without access. And then we asked them, you know, what is their feedback like? And they said, if we have, you know, really meaningful connections, it gives you a chance to learn about the match. And, you know, I definitely recommend this. They go to the annual meetings. They are, you know, given opportunities to talk at podiums. They go to the welcome receptions, the resident receptions, they go to dinner with the mentors, they go to the president's banquet, they go to the meeting sessions, and then we ask them, you know, was it valuable, was it not valuable, what'd you get out of it, and so forth. And, you know, this is a work in progress. We're still learning how to do this, but we just felt like we had to start somewhere. And, you know, these are some of the scholars who had leaders in the field of ped surgery. All right, so talk about who we are, what we do. So as pediatric surgery programs have evolved, more and more programs receive accreditation, which means more and more pediatric surgeons are then created. Many of them don't necessarily retire. So walking through this graph, this blue line with the dots on it, it represents the number of pediatric surgeons over time. These are board certified pediatric surgeons. So we use the American Board of Surgery data from recertifications in order to like gather this data. So we looked at recertification for your So at that time, every 10 years, you had to recertify. Now it's changed and so forth. But we looked at recertification data and we said, how many pediatric surgeons are recertifying each year? I mean, how many general surgeons are recertifying each year? And they're able to tell you what surgeries they've done over the last 2 years in order to recertify. You had to say, I did a certain number of cases so that you have an idea. So those have to be logged in. And so you get a pretty good idea of what general surgeons are doing in the community, in the world, not just academic, because they have to recertify for their board. So these are active general surgeons. So over time, as the number of pediatric surgeons has increased, the blue line with the squiggly line with the dots around it, the number of pediatric surgeries that are being done, surgeries that are done on kids, has decreased with kids. So this is general surgeons that do pediatric surgical procedures in orange. So that number has steadily decreased over time, which makes sense. So if you have a lot more pediatric surgeons, they're going to do the brunt of the pediatric surgeries, not the adult general surgeons, because there's more pediatric surgeons around. So if you're a parent, you're probably going to have the pediatric surgeon do the pediatric surgery case. And so the adult surgeons steadily decrease. What that means is that if you live in a community that doesn't necessarily have access to pediatric surgery, you have to go see an adult surgeon and get your care. Or you have to go somewhere else. You have to travel a longer distance to get your care, or you may have to be transferred to a place that has a pediatric surgeon. So he said, well, what happens to all of those patients that live in rural communities? That's about 13%, 14% of the country. How far do they have to travel to get their care? And are they getting transferred more often? And let's pick out the cases that we feel like adult surgeons should be able to do in pediatric surgery, like taking out an appendix, taking out a gallbladder, fixing a hernia, things that adult surgeons do a lot of, in fact, probably more than pediatric surgeons do, and probably do pretty well. And what we found was there was no difference in the age groups, sex between the rural and urban groups. But the rural groups were, for the most part, white, had Medicaid, and were typically treated at adult hospitals without pediatric, like it was just a pure adult hospital. And over time, the number of, the distance that they had to travel to get their care has steadily increased, like huge amounts. And this is for gallbladders, appendectomies, supracondylar fractures, so on and so forth. And this number of patients who are being transferred to get their definitive care has also increased. So in 2002, 2005, 2008, the rural and urban populations were very similar in terms of number of people who had to get transferred for the appendectomies and whatnot, so forth. So huge increase in who is doing those cases and where they're getting done.
Question, does that have more to do with the facility ability to manage kids? Because I think, because.
Not for these procedures, because these are all outpatient.
Okay.
They should be like, and they're somewhat, like within the next few weeks kind of thing for hernias, and then appendectomy should be pretty immediate. So, you show up, you get your appendix taken out pretty much within the next day. So this is a huge burden that the rural patients think. So then we said, okay, these are the common procedures. What happens to the complex procedures? As they become more and more pediatric surgeons, who's doing all of the rare cases, and how many are we doing them? And so when you look at those, we find that a lot of cases, so these are percentage of pediatric surgeons that had no cases over the past year in that specific category. So 4% of pediatric surgeons had not done an appendectomy. More importantly, 60% of pediatric surgeons had not done a Kasai procedure for like a rare, anomaly. 45% had not done a kidney tumor resection within the past year. I've not done a kidney tumor resection in the past year. I've not done a Kasai last year because, I have done Kasai because I'm the HPP guy. But I'm saying that these have become subspecialized now, because even within pediatric surgery, as more and more pediatric surgeons exist, what we do has to change, because these are rare anomalies and you're not going to be the person to do all of the cases. which is what we're trained to do during our pediatric surgery. But you don't get to do all of them because they're just not as common. The congenital anomalies, these rare anomalies, are going to occur at some frequency based on the population. That frequency is not going to change that dramatically in a stable population. And so what has happened is it's become a subspecialization within pediatric surgery. And so what we find is like the number of places that become, I do all the oncology, I do all the anorectal malformations, I do all the chest wall deformities, I do inflammatory bowel disease, I do HPB. Those have like differentiated now within pediatric surgery, because this happened in general surgery probably like 30 years ago, where you're like, oh, this person is the GI person, this person is the thoracic, this person is the vascular surgeon. And it's based on, as the volume of surgeons has increased, they're going to do less and less of certain types of cases that they're going to encounter. And so the subspecialization naturally increases.
So we have a scaling problem in pediatrics, right? Because, you know, we're not gonna like get the numbers like you're suggesting in huge amount, right? And I will say that like,
Yes.
we've had conversations internally about like, well, who does more thyroids? Like, and I don't know what the current state is, because I think they just hired someone, but like, perhaps an adult who does a ton of thyroids is actually a better surgeon in terms of outcomes than someone
data on
who's
that.
pediatric, you know, like, I mean, I think there's like, when you're talking about some like really rare conditions, like, you might expect the expertise to lie more in like the frequency regardless of like the big or small population, you know?
Correct. You're right. Thyroids doesn't exist because, well, not here, because there's only one person here that does all of our thyroids. And he actually does more than any of the adult providers here, because he does all of the kids' thyroids. So it doesn't apply to thyroids here, but I agree with what you're saying. But that becomes what happens is like, as a pediatric surgeon, you're like, say I do a lot of IBD, right? The adult providers are going to do more IBDs than any I do. The problem then becomes is that if they do all the 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, who's doing the 12-year-olds? Are they going to do the 12-year-olds? Because they're not. Are they going to do the 11-year-olds? They're not. Where does my volume from doing those 11 and 12-year-olds come from? Like, it has to come from the 16 to 19-year-olds. Because if I don't do those 16 and 19-year-olds, I'm the one who has to do the 11 and 12-year-olds, which are going to be even rarer. So I think that you have to be very careful around going, okay, the adult providers, they're going to do a ton more stuff. Like, that's great. I'm really happy for that. But then they have to be willing to accommodate the much younger population that is going to need those same surgeries. Because if they can't, that becomes problematic, because those kids are now going to get worse care, because you're not getting the expertise, right? Because the expertise is going to be in that adolescent population that's shared among groups.
Yeah, just like, you know, when your thyroid surgeon leaves, then like, what do you do, right? I mean, it's like,
That's
there's these
absolutely right.
shocks to the system, right, that just relate to like capacity.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
So this some of what you're saying reminds me of the debate in cardiology and congenital heart disease about regionalization versus the trade-off between essentially having a few centers that are really, really good at congenital heart disease care, right, for complex things, versus the fact that if you regionalize everything, people have to travel long distance, right, which is not always feasible, especially if you're low income. So I'm wondering, pediatric surgery, to what degree have there been discussions about regionalization? Or is it just, because not every specialty most specialties face this problem, I think pediatrics, especially I think in general, especially the procedural ones. But I think that not every specialty actually has an organized approach to it. Or at least organized discussions, formalized discussions.
Yeah, so multiple meetings over the last 5 years in the pediatric surgery, the American Pediatric Surgery Association, have discussed like outcomes, regionalization, how do we, the topic is actually right child, right surgeon. The people like who needs to travel, who doesn't travel. And in fact, this work here then led me to look at specifically like specialization and how people feel about it, anti versus pro specialization, different groups, get more data on like you know, the percentage within groups that have a specialist versus don't have a specialist and how they feel about it. Which then led me to like identifying a specific specialization where, so fetal surgery, this is the one I used, because that's what I have access to and know a lot about. And we looked at the type of surgeries that are being done across the country in terms of like whoever specializes in fetal surgery. And then we said, we should create actual lists and say, these are things that merit a specialization. Like if you can create those boundaries for different things, like, do I really want every kid who is 16-year-old and has an appendectomy to have to travel like 60 to 100 miles to like get their care? No, absolutely not. Like they should get their care close to home. But do I want like a 5-year-old with an appendectomy being done by the adult surgeon? No. And there's plenty of appendixes to develop expertise in doing the 5-year-olds. Like, so I think you can draw a line in that, maybe 10, maybe 12, whatever, and say, this population should travel. This population doesn't need to travel. And you can create that criteria based on data that we already have, based on our outcomes, based on the frequency that they occur, based on the travel distances. But it does need to be organized, like you're saying, at a higher level and kind of thought about. The problem is there's no like clear-cut higher level without authority to be able to do that for, say, pediatric surgery, but you could do it for the subspecialties. So what I did was for the fetal subspecialty, that's NAFNet is what controls it. They determine what centers are fetal centers, and they can determine what cases should be done at fetal centers, how many are being done, and you can follow that just like you would with like thoracic surgery, like STS does that. So there are ways to do it for certain things, and like that's probably where it starts, and then that then defines it, and then you can like study those long term. And then as you do those rare ones, like the Kasai's, we already have that list of like pediatric surgeons that have done no cases in the last year. For the ones that are like over 30%, I don't know, pick some criteria, right? And then all of those cases, you can kind of go, okay, these probably should be subspecialized amongst institutions. And then you can designate them as cancer centers, designate them as fetal centers, designate them as whatever those might be for those specific centers. I think it has to start somewhere, and I think it has to start at a place that has some authority, and the subspecialization is probably where it will begin, and then it'll grow to other areas.
It's never in the financial interest of any given individual children's hospital to
Yes.
give up their ability to do rare procedure X so that their neighboring giant, kind of neighbor in the south or whatever can do it.
Right.
I feel like the financial incentives aren't there, and then the insurance aspects aren't there either, right? Because you have to basically be able to convince the insurer to pay for out-of-state care. And a lot of times that's not possible.
Yeah, so we had a similar encounter around like long gap for esophageal atresia, which occurs in about 10% of esophageal atresias, which is already a very rare condition. And we, as pediatric surgeons at Mott, travel to other hospitals, and we've been doing this for like 20 years. So like we have a pretty good idea of like what cases should and should not be done at these other centers. And so we used to cover like Flint, Hurley, for example, and they were frustrated because we would transfer care to Mott for like a tumor that needs to be resected and so forth. And we said, one, that's important for growth of our fellowship and our index cases. Two, we need the support. If I get into trouble, it's nice to have another surgeon next door, whereas you don't have that early. Three, like you need the other expertise, not just the surgeon, but like the anesthesiologist, the nursing, the oncologist, the so on and so forth, that's important to care of these kind of children. And so they said, well, we're losing all this money, we're losing all these patients. And we said, okay, let's look to see how many of these patients actually get transferred versus the number that we actually do at your center. And it's like 6 cases over the course of a year that got transferred here versus like the hundreds of patients that we took care of at your institution. And you're like, overall benefit from us covering you, despite the fact that you lose a handful of patients to the major center. So I think that people have this like preconceived notion of like, oh my God, we transfer all these patients out. And it's like, no, you remember those patients who spend more time in the hospital, they're more complicated, they require a lot more resources. So you remember those, that numerator that you're transferring out, but the denominator of patients that are taken care of with like water abscess that goes home from the ED, the like appendectomy that got done the next day, the hernias that got repaired as outpatient. You don't recall those patients because they happen so like quickly and like, but those numbers more than outweigh. And so all of those patients benefited from not having to travel for their routine care that could have gotten closer at home. And so it can be done. It's just that convincing administration to understand that you can't treat all of them the same way, I think is really challenging. All right. This is kind of final of what we do. So the final thing is like, I noticed it was a pain in the ass to finally get promoted to being associate professor. And so, which is really cool. I'm glad Cheer supported me throughout this whole process, and I wouldn't have done it without Cheer, for sure, 100%. But I was like, is this a Samir problem or is this a Pete surgery problem? Because I was like, man, I feel like I work really hard and I try to like study and learn, and like, I was like, am I really that bad? It took me like, so I finished my general surgery in 2008 and I got promoted last year. So that's a long time to get promoted. And so I was like, is this just me? Do I just suck? It takes me longer to like understand stuff, or is this happening everywhere? So we looked at the NIH reporter, which kind of like highlights who's getting like NIH grants, because that's really still kind of a gold standard across the country for peds surgery, at least in academics in terms of getting promoted and so forth, especially on like an instructional, non-clinical track. And then we looked at APSA memberships from 2012 to 2022, and we looked to see what percentage of them were getting a grant. And what you find is that out of the total APSA membership, only about like 3 to 5% actually gets funded in a given year. So, or has funding in a given year. So if somebody got funding in like 2013, but it like also included 2012, we included them in that group. And so if somebody got funding in 2021, but also included 2022, we included them in that group. And we found that at any given time, 3 to 5% of pediatric surgeons have funding. So that funding amount actually has decreased over time. And less people will get funded because more and more people are going into a clinical track. Sarah.
Since I have actually no idea, what does that look like across other subspecialties?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't actually know. I don't know, but it would be a really cool study for other people to do it too within different studies. I don't know the answer. I do know that it's pretty low for other general surgery, like subspecialties, like plastics and I think thoracic looked at theirs. And so we used theirs in our study. And theirs was a lot, the percentage was slightly higher than ours, but not that much. So despite the fact that you needed 22 publications to get into pediatric surgery, only 3% of them get funded later on. That's pretty bad, right? So like, what are we doing here? And so I went through and I was like, okay, how long does it take to get funded? And it turns out that it takes longer and longer and longer to get funded. And so we're looking at like 7 to 10 year windows to get funding. And that doesn't make any sense, at least from a peds surgery standpoint, unless you do something to change that, because it's actually harder to get funded. And in fact, of the 37, 24 of them were previously funded. So it's not like you're getting new people getting funding. It's the same people who've been funded who continue to get funding. So we've created this system where it's really hard as a new person wanting to get funding. So I was like, oh, I don't feel as bad about myself. But it actually turns out we've actually made it hard for like people of color, for people who are women. And in fact, the funding amounts, when you look at those, has actually decreased, has increased overall, but has decreased for those who identify as Black, who are Hispanic. So the type of funding also has changed. So I'm sure like other people need to look at this within their own professions and so forth. I looked at it because I was like feeling bad about myself, but it turns out that it's it's probably gonna be true for many other things if you look through it. And it's really easy, it's publicly available data. All we had to do was ask APSA for a membership list from like, and we said, listen, we're not gonna like spread this around, we're just doing it as part of a data thing, and then we just deleted the list after we were done. And they were totally fine with
And
it.
this is specifically ped surg.
This is specifically pediatric surgery. And it's still mostly basic science that got funded. And we actually did like a recent Twitter chat to kind of highlight this article amongst like the community to try to see if like people are noticing this trend across other subspecialties and other domains.
I bet some of that,
So-
I bet the percentage would be slightly higher if you didn't use NIH Reporter and actually asked people,
Yeah.
just because NIH Reporter is only gonna report
Yes.
the contact PI. So if you're in a multi-institutional giant clinical trial and you're like investigator number 2, you don't get listed on NIH Reporter.
Yeah, but those people also don't actually get promoted. Like, it's a pain in the ass, like unless it's your grant, your PI and you're like primary.
But even if
it's
you're an
really hard.
MPI, right? Even if you're an MPI. I'm not saying it's not a problem, right?
MPIs get listed though, on there. I'm listed, I'm an MPI. MPI is listed. You have to be a PI level on there.
Yeah, otherwise don't get listed.
Seen both names for all the grants, whether
Yeah.
MPI.
And an age.
Samir, can I ask you something? And this is a question I have across many specialties. You very eloquently describe how long it takes to qualify as a pediatric surgeon, general surgeon. And yet those that are involved in research are doing basic science. And I'm wondering, does that make any sense? The basic science could probably be done by individuals with different specialties, PhDs, that I just don't understand a system that demands that a person spend so many years specializing in a field like surgery and then does something bench work.
Yeah, so David, I think, so first of all, I don't think like, I think sometimes you end up where you end up almost serendipitously. Second, basic science is really common among surgeons because you have access to tissue. So you have something that most people do not have access to. Like, I can get you tissue of bowel, like, because I operate on bowel and I'm able to then study that bowel for that specific pathology that created the problem in the first place. So that's why you go into basic science, is because you have access to that and you understand that process very directly.
I don't know, somehow it doesn't seem to be a very efficient use of human resources. Because the more, in order to have a research career,
Yeah, but David, you're
you're
looking
gonna
at,
have to be spending more and more time doing research.
I completely disagree with you because honestly, when you get to the like efficiency model, then you lose something. Like it, in fact, everything in DEI will tell you what you want is actually a very diverse group of people who think completely different from each other, especially now that we've solved very simple problems. We have really complex problems to solve. When you have complex problems that you want to solve, you want to get as diverse a group thinking about the problem as possible from different angles. So you don't want an efficiency there. You want cognitive power from different angles.
If there is maybe a criticism here, it's my guess would be that there probably aren't that many pediatric surgeons who have NIH funding to actually do health services research,
Yes.
that actually do anything in the realm of like clinical, quality, for example, process improvement, anything like implementation science, the kind of stuff that surgeons tend to gravitate towards. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So there's a lot of people who do QI in surgery, very
But
few
not
that are
funded,
funded.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, right. They're doing
exactly
it
right.
at a small scale,
Yeah,
right?
because it's incredibly hard.
Yeah, because because there's not a dedicated agency for this?
I
Or
mean, like,
would be the only one, but
the
Marcus are.
things that had to go right for me to get funded is like, I had to somehow end up at like the premier pediatric health services place in the country that is willing to accept subspecialists who are not pediatricians. Like, that is just incredible luck that I ended up here. And I got great mentorship, I got great advice, I got a lot of patience from like, and the number of times I talked to Lisa about like quitting or giving up or like, I'm never gonna make it in this is like, I can't tell you, like, and it's just, not everyone has that kind of luck. Like, it's just, yes, I worked hard and I feel like I have earned this, but like, environment plays a huge role, and I think like, I mean, just looking around the room, look at how many people here are like funded in HSR, like, that absolutely has to have an influence on me. And I think like, unless, like, if you want to see this number improve, you gotta like be intentional about it. And so the question is, do we want to see that number improve? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think as pediatric surgery leaders around the country, they have to decide, like, hey, if we want to like breed a certain phenotype of surgeon, like, we have to focus on those phenotypes, whether it's subspecialization, whether it's increasing access, whether it's reducing papers, like whatever that might be, those are all needs that I presented. Like, we have to be intentional about who we are and what we do. Right? Final kind of topic. How do we do that? So this is the last piece of work, defining practice readiness. So this is, David, around the stuff that you were alluding to, like, how do we become pediatric surgeons? Do we get any kind of skills education? So here you do, because we kind of like thought about it and we said, okay, there are different components to like being a surgeon beyond technical skills. And how do we help them become independent? And we created this model where we actually try to like make our surgeons autonomous before they even leave, but by using, so we actually share, so we have like, for example, we'll have them record a video of a procedure that they do, our fellows, and we send it to these institutions to then review the video and then kind of critique the video and highlight things that they can and see within the video. We'll have them do a communication assessment tool by patients and families, and they will then highlight things that could be improved over time. We have them do these operative evaluations. After every one of them, they get basically grading or feedback on each of them. And so we have been very intentional at our center, as well as the centers listed here, around trying to do this. And you can actually predict at what point does a surgeon become autonomous and which case level. And what's really interesting is, I think people think about these cases as independent of each other, and they're not. There are overlapping skill sets that exist. So if you do a certain number of laparoscopic appendectomies, you will steadily improve your laparoscopic skills such that when you do a lap colon, that actually allows you to be autonomous. So I have data now on like 6 different fellows, and I can tell you that it takes 14 appies for our fellows to become independent. I can tell you it takes similar amount for inguinal hernias to be independent, but it takes a lot longer for colons to be independent because they occur with less frequency. However, if you do enough appies, you will also decrease the number of colectomies that you have to do to achieve that independence. So it's really cool, like, once you have enough data, what you could do in terms of like figuring out practice readiness for technical skills. I would love to do this for like non-technical skills over time, but that's next level project. So we talked to our own institution here, Deb Weinstein, who was here recently and has left for ACGME, on doing what's called promotion in place program, where if someone meets certain criteria, we talk to the American Board of Surgery about college, that they would then become an attending here for the last portion of their fellowship in order to become autonomous, be able to bill, learn those skill sets so that like they're basically serving the role of an attending instead of July 30th, they're still fellow, and then August 1st, they become an attending, and then have all of the issues that go along with that. If you knew that on April 30, they're ready to be attending, they'll be an attending, and then May first, they still have very close, tight mentorship that's within the program where they're still being supervised, they have somebody to go to, somebody's assigned to that. But it takes some level of dedication to do that, because now you have somebody who could be billing at a higher level, and how does that play into costs, and they're not getting the same salary, and so there's other issues that have to be dealt with, but at least we can get around, like, how do we make them autonomous before they, is it based on the number of hours that they work, or is it based on their competency within a certain procedures and so forth? So, last slide, hopefully the next generation is more diverse, subspecialized, and competent. Thanks.
But I have a question on, so in a competency-based evaluation system where you have the promotion in place, you could potentially individualize the completion date.
That's right.
So you were talking about the example where you could be completed and deemed autonomous prior to the chronologic date of the end of your fellowship. But what about the converse where you're not quite there yet when the date hits? Is there provisions to be able to flex in both directions?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. We've been lucky in terms of like the fellows that we've had, and like, I mean, these are already like barely filtered individuals that end up as peds surgeons. But I don't know the answer, because
Maybe
right
it's
now,
just like
right now you don't have anything. They leave at like June 30th. The
Right,
only
you're
thing you
done,
have is
right,
like,
yeah.
yeah, like, who's not gonna sign off on someone because there was like some minutia here or there? Do you know what I mean?
I was thinking about like, you just never got the Kasai because it
Right.
didn't come to you
Right.
during your time, so you've
Right.
never done that
Yeah,
procedure
so,
and.
yeah, that has to happen at a program level, right? Like where programs have to then identify certain procedures that they're not going to have enough of at their center. And then either partner with another program that's gonna see more of those, or like, I think that's something that is at a program director level is being talked about, because there, as more and more programs get, a fellowship, like no one gets their fellowship taken away, and it's like, you need to look at that, because not all of them are getting those numbers when they graduate. Like those numbers were for those who had had to recertify. And so some of it may have been done purposefully, where they were like, yeah, I'm not gonna do any more on cases, we have a on specialist. And so those numbers were based off of 10-year board recertification data, not necessarily
Initial training.
yeah, initial training. But when you look at the initial training numbers, those are scary too, because we have a pretty wide spectrum of things that we see here and we're pretty good about, but there's some things they're not gonna do. Like, we're not gonna do like insulinomas and pancreatectomies. Like, they all end up at CHOP. Like, we just don't do those. We don't have the like imaging structure, so on and so forth. And so there are certain things our fellowship will not be exposed to, but like, they also, when they're done as pediatric surgeons, are they really gonna be doing those cases unless they go to those institutions? And so you have to pick and choose as a program, what things that are like absolutely essential that you must graduate with from a technical standpoint. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, guys.